Hi, today's lecture is about the basic overview of the brain anatomy. So let's get started. As you can see from the diagram, we have the brain. Typically, the brain is divided into two major regions. We call this the forebrain, and this guy, the hindbrain. Or the big brain, as we call it, can also be called the cerebrum, and the little hindbrain can be called the cerebellum. You see a lot of grooves in this diagram. These little grooves are called sulci. And the meaty part of the brain, anywhere you have the meaty part, are called gyri or gyrus. Think of gyromeat as the meaty part of the brain. So anywhere you have these big chunks, that is considered the gyri. Here we have the lateral fissure. Fissures are almost a variation of sulci. The only difference is fissures tend to be a little bit bigger. So you have one right here, the lateral fissure, and then you have one up here that separates the brain into a left and right cerebral hemisphere called the longitudinal fissure. Now, if we come down here to the bottom, you don't really see it too well, but this is the brain stem. So you don't see the midbrain, but we see the little first bump right here. This is the pons, and this is the medulla oblongata, and then this of the midbrain that's internal a little bit, the pons and medulla oblongata. Now, the cerebrum can be divided into four lobes. Frontal lobe, which is mainly responsible for higher learning functions, also some personality and mood, information processing. Sometimes you can think of it as kind of like the boss of the brain or the moody part of the brain. The parietal lobe, this guy is mainly dealing with spatial reasoning and tactile sensory processing. The occipital lobe of the brain consists of vision processing, and the temporal lobe of the brain is dealing with language, hearing, and memory. Now, these are just some basic overview things of the cerebrum. There's obviously a lot more detail as far as what it actually does and doesn't do between each lobe of the brain. The cerebellum is involved with body control, motion memory, and usually deals primarily with fine motor control. Now, this picture is a cross section of the brain, and here you can see some structures a little bit better and more internal structures. Again, we can see these sulci, and we can see the meaty parts of the brain, known as the gyri again. Now, if you come over here, this area that's a little bit lighter, this is known as the corpus callosum. The back part of the corpus callosum right here is called the fornix. This little area right here is called the septum pellucidum. It separates the left and right side of the cerebral hemisphere. It kind of connects the two. And then if you puncture this, you will come to the lateral ventricles, which are just openings that contain cerebral spinal fluid. Right here, this area of the brain is called the thalamus, and the lower part of this region is called the hypothalamus. Now, the thalamus sorts all kinds of data for the brain, so it's like the data processing center. The hypothalamus, on the other hand, does a lot of information processing as well. This is kind of considered the homeostasis of the brain. So it has the internal thermostat of the brain. We always hear 98.6 degrees is, well, one of the thermostats that's setting that temperature is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus also does a lot of things with thermoregulation, hunger, thirst, fight and flight responses, rest and digest. So you can kind of get an appreciation. It has a lot of systemic processing going on here. If you go a little bit below that, you have this little stalk extending gland called the pituitary gland. It has an anterior and posterior section. And this has a lot of endocrine hormones. The anterior has quite a few more hormones than the posterior pituitary. Posterior pituitary has oxytocin and vasopressin, whereas the anterior pituitary has anything ranging from follicular stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, which are some of your reproductive hormones. Has ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, which is one of the steroid hormones that's going to go to your adrenal glands. Growth hormone, thyroid stimulating hormones, just to name just a little quick overview of some of these hormones. So this is going to be a major endocrine organ. Right here, this is part of the optic chiasm, where it kind of the optic nerve crisscrosses, and we'll do a little better diagram of this here a little bit later on. When you come to this part of the brain, this is considered the brainstem, which consists of three parts: the midbrain, the pons, and medulla oblongata. And right below that, where it kind of stretches out and narrows up, this is the spinal cord, so don't include that in the brainstem. The brainstem is very important because a lot of your heart rate regulation and breathing centers are located in the brainstem, as well as swallowing, so very important. So if you ever have an injury to this part, you risk losing your breathing and heart rate regulation, and this can be detrimental and severe consequences. You may not survive. All right, this is the cerebellum. You can see it has a cross section, and you can see these little tree branches. In Latin, that's called the arbor vitae, which means tree of life, because it looks like tree branches. If we go to the base of the, back up top, at the base of the corpus callosum, you see a little structure right here. This little structure is called the pineal body. And this also has a hormone called melatonin. And if you remember, this is what sets your 24-hour clock. So individuals that work midnight shifts or don't get access to sun as much can disrupt this 24-hour clock, because melatonin has a direct relationship with the sun and how much sunlight you get. But still, a lot is unknown about this little guy. Right below that, you have the superior colliculi and inferior colliculi. These guys are dealing. So this concludes our basic overview of the brain anatomy. If you have any further questions, feel free to reach out to me. Dealing with the reflexes for the light stimuli and sound stimuli.